What are Israel's goals in Lebanon? Is it even possible to return these settlers to the north? I mean, tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands have already either fled to other places across Israel or have left the country altogether.
Yeah. Well, first, I mean, I want to get into that, but first, thank you, John, for that tremendous report and detailed explanation. I think it answered a lot of questions that I had, and I know that many of our viewers had. And just while we were speaking, there's news coming in and video, and it's being reported now. I can see on the screen of Al Jazeera as well, of a large explosion in the Israeli port of Eilat. And the initial reports say that 3 drones came in, 2 of them were intercepted, and 1 of them hit a warehouse in the port of Eilat. And it's being said that they came from the east. So the speculation is they came from Iraq. So this just goes to show that this can't be contained. It will continue to spread. And Nora, to your question, I mean, what are the stated goal of Israel is to return the settlers back to the kibbutzes and the colonies in the north of Palestine, in the Galilee and on the Lebanese border. And I think of this the same way as how Israel's stated goal for the genocide in Gaza is to bring back the hostages, as they call them. But what is the result of Israel's effort to bring back the hostages? It's to kill the hostages.
Yeah.
And, there was Netanyahu actually briefed Israeli lawmakers this week that he estimated that half of the Israeli POWs and detainees in Gaza are still alive, of the 101 thought to still have remained there. And he thought, oh, this is a pretty good number. I mean, the way I think of it is that he's achieved his goal of killing half of them and wants to, and still has to kill the rest in his mindset. And so it's similar. Israel's stated goal of bringing the Israelis back to the north is actually going to end up with more of them leaving their homes and none of them coming back for an indefinite period of time. It's very obvious that just as the real goal of the genocide in Gaza is to destroy the Palestinian people, to liquidate the Palestinian cause, the goal in Lebanon, at least the initial goal, is to break the link between Lebanon and Gaza. As Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah has been very clear that nothing will break that link. And he said it in his words, in his speech that John referred to. He said, no matter what the price, we will not stop the support of Gaza. We will not leave the Palestinian people alone. So this is a shock and awe operation to try to say to the Lebanese people generally and to Hezbollah, we will do to you what we've done to Palestinians in Gaza unless this stops. And that explains why they've targeted civilians in such a direct way, using these ridiculous fabricated stories of missiles in people's attics, as if Hezbollah would keep missiles in people's attics, when we've seen the underground complexes where Hezbollah actually keeps the missiles.
And I've shown you months of rocket fire from Hezbollah. There's not a house. That's just.
Yeah. So that's the clear goal, and it's not going to succeed because Hezbollah has too much invested. For them, it's existential. So what's the next stage? I mean, either a very long war of attrition, and I want to get to that in a moment when I talk about the Iron Dome, but the news also that has just happened this evening is that Israel has called up 2 reserve brigades and is talking about a ground operation in Gaza. Now, you can look at this in a couple of ways. Because also with there's another announcement that came with the announcement of the call up of the reserve brigades, which I think is a total of about 8,000 soldiers. I think each brigade is about 4,000. So they're talking about a call up of 8,000 for a potential ground operation Gaza. At the same time, we've had the news that Netanyahu has authorized his representative Ron Dermer, the ex-American Miami-born Ron Dermer, who gave up his U.S. citizenship in order to become Israel's ambassador to Washington, and is now, one of, I think he's Netanyahu's national security advisor. He's authorized him to go and tell the Biden administration that, look, we're willing to agree a ceasefire with Hezbollah. And from the reporting I've seen, it's a separate ceasefire. It's not a ceasefire, a global ceasefire, which Hezbollah said is the condition for stopping the war at the north. So, a ceasefire that includes Gaza, it would be a separate ceasefire. That's what Israel wants. And so by mobilizing the brigades, they're bluff. Well, what's the right word? Bluffing. Is it bluffing? We don't know. They're saying, look, we're ready now to invade or to send in ground troops, but look, we're giving you this way out in the form of this ceasefire agreement. And of course, it's absolutely impossible that Hezbollah will accept that. So what comes next? That's the question. The Israelis may even think that they're bluffing. They may even think that they're calling up these troops just to threaten Hezbollah and to raise the ante. But what I think there's a real risk of happening is that when the Israelis fail in breaking Lebanon with these horrific aerial massacres, just as they failed in breaking Lebanon in all of Israel's previous massacres, and as they have failed in breaking Gaza for these past 11 months of bombardment and genocide, they'll say, well, now our choices as Israel is either to back down or to escalate further. And the further escalation is to send in ground troops. So in a sense, the Israelis get caught in their own trap. And I think there is a very real risk that even if the Israelis don't intend now to send in ground troops, that they're going to end up doing it anyway, because they can't help themselves. There's a phrase that's used very commonly on Arabic by Arabic analysts, al-hurub ila al-amam, meaning escaping forwards. The idea is that, you've got a big problem here. What do? Well, you run forwards to an even bigger problem, and you keep doing that. And that describes Israel's strategy. And I think there's a real risk of that with these developments. So I don't know. I want to talk about the Iron Dome, but I want to let others comment on I'm reacting now to the breaking news, let's say.
Let me jump in on the ground invasion, because let's think about what a ground invasion looks like. They have 3 divisions already up on the border. They stayed there. They didn't come down after October 7th. They had to leave them up on the border for fear that Hezbollah would join that battle. I talked to you last week or the week before about the 98th Division, which was the Raider Division in Gaza that went around and made the mass graves at Shifa Hospital, and Shujaiya battled in the Jabalia camp reinvasion, reinvaded Khan Yunis. So their battle-tested troops, that's who they would send, who are supposed to go back into Gaza, but are now being deployed on the border. Well, they're not being deployed on the border, because this is the next thing that I want to say. For a ground invasion of Lebanon, Israel is going to have to come over into the 15 kilometers of space inside the buffer zone that has been created inside Israel. Their troops have to traverse that space first before they can even enter Lebanon, and they haven't been able to. And the Radwan forces are prepared for that. Nasrallah joked about how we don't see their soldiers because they're so out of that buffer zone, that he carries a lantern around looking for where Israeli soldiers might be. So they have to move through that very dangerous area, with Hezbollah having fighting on the mountain. Sun Tzu said, never fight uphill. So Israel's about to do that. And then you have this battle-tested Hezbollah force, who's the Radwan forces, who are prepared for this. They've been preparing for it for 18 years. They are tactically skilled. They're well trained as any army in the world. Special forces. They're experienced. They're well armed. They've had full arming from Iran. They have, because of Syria, they have a land corridor to train, to arm, to improve their skills in those kind of trainings. They operated in Syria interoperable with Russian special forces. So they have all kinds of these experiences that Israeli troops don't have. And we watched Israeli troops perform in the Gaza Strip. And I think when Nasrallah says this is a historic opportunity, I believe him. And I said months ago before that I think that there's just as likely to be a battle in the Galilee as there is to be a battle in Bint Jishbel. The process that it would take for the Israelis to move these 3 divisions from back 15 kilometers, push them through this buffer zone while higher forces are looking down on it, and then get through the wadis that they couldn't get through in 2006. The wadis don't change, right? In a city, you can pick a different road. A wadi through a mountain doesn't give you, they're going to be going through the same ones that they were smoked in 2006. So this ground invasion, once the population of the south has moved, which the devastating pictures of them yesterday moving up the highway, the 4-lane highway to Beirut, just wall-to-wall cars. But once that village is empty, and it's going to be an Israeli military on Hezbollah military fight in that area, it's not clear to me that the Israelis overrun that area and are fighting inside Lebanon any more than it is Hezbollah coming down and fighting in the Galilee. Israel's biting off more than they can chew on this one. They can bomb, they can massacre, they can genocide, they can kill civilians who didn't have anything to do with it and drop apartment towers on their head. But in a military to military confrontation, taking everything that we've seen from Gaza, a besieged area, Hezbollah is a completely different game. And
yeah,
I don't see how this goes for Israel.
Yeah, and then
I do see how it goes. It goes extremely poorly and could be hasten the decline that we're watching of Israel and Zionism.
And you have to consider, I completely agree with that, John. You have to consider that in the current situation, Israel's advantage is and has always been its air force. Right now, they have the ability to bomb, as they're doing, to murder civilians on a massive scale, as they're deliberately doing in Lebanon, in Gaza. That's always been their forte. Whatever air defenses Lebanon has are minimal. They cannot cope with this scale of air attack. And the moment the ground troops go into Lebanon, then Israel is playing to Hezbollah's strengths. And that's a situation that which is why I like you believe it when Nasrallah says we would welcome you. And he said in one of his speeches, you're going to come to Lebanon with that broken army that we see in Gaza. They say, well, welcome.
Welcome, Habibi. Yeah.
Yeah.
Who's army, Habibi?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about what may be a scenario, which is a prolonged war of attrition. And the reason I bring this up is because I think many people initially thought, well, why is, we saw this, like 500 people massacred in a single day, just this brutal, the usual Israeli behavior. And at first, the Hezbollah response seemed quite tame. People thought, well, why isn't Hezbollah? They've shown us all these big rockets. Why aren't they launching, the big rockets at Tel Aviv and so on? And of course, we understand the dilemma, which is that the moment you do that, they are going to start bombing Beirut the way they've been bombing Gaza City. And Hezbollah, if they can, they want to avoid bringing even more or I don't want to say bringing because that sounds like I'm blaming them. Israel is solely to blame. But that's the situation in which they know Israel would behave that way. And if they can avoid it, they want to. And so, and it's perhaps even what Israel wants. So so this slow escalation, this steady escalation, this avoidance of major, they can clearly hit the heart of Haifa, which is a major city and an economic center in Israel. They've chosen not to do that. They've been targeting the military infrastructure, the military bases, and the settlements, which are already largely evacuated, as a way to say you can't come back. But they're not risking a large number of civilians. So this war of attrition could go on a long time.
Hezbollah has the rocket capacity to fire, like the Israeli planners believe, 5,000 rockets in a day. In Gaza, during the operation of October 7th, they fired 5,000 rockets in an hour. So to be real about what is possible for a group that has 200,000 rockets of this nature, if you want to overwhelm the Iron Dome, they could point all of their launchers at a particular moment to a target, and Iron Dome simply doesn't have the number of the number of missiles, interceptors, as you rightly described, to handle an attack like that. And that is something that is hanging over this battle. 300 rockets is significant. Israel can handle 300 rockets, but there was still major landings of those rockets, strikes on the bases that they intended to hit. There is a considerable amount of range for expanding the airstrikes versus rocket war, and it's very much in question that Israel's Iron Dome or David Sling can handle this properly. The next level up of rockets that Hezbollah can fire require David Sling interceptions, not Iron Dome. And David Sling, as you said, has the same problems of generating enough interceptor missiles. And those missiles are closer to $1 million a pop. The Patriot missile systems that will have to be deployed for the top level of Hezbollah's missile arsenal, those are more like $2 and $3 million an interceptor. There's a math equation at some point on a war of attrition, of a constant rocket war of attrition, that simply there is no answer for Israel to that. At some point, the rockets will not be able to be intercepted and they will be hitting Israel. What stage in that war, how quickly we get to that stage, and using all of these interceptors up on military bases is going to leave their population vulnerable for total war should that open up. So Israel's been able to keep their home front sort of calm by this. They lie about it, but the effectiveness of the Iron Dome, that 90 to 95% number, is that number is not real. We know it from the Iranian attack, True Promise, in April. That it's not. They said 99% in that one, but we have numbers. There's studies on Iron Dome that show that the interception rate is not nearly what they claim, and they always are able to say the interceptions that didn't happen they always say happened in an open area. That is not always the case, and a lot of times those open area rockets would be normally intercepted. So we're seeing what would happen when they're hitting the open areas, and it's classified how many batteries they have, how many of these Iron Dome launch batteries that they have. There's unknown, but we know there's a shortage of missiles for their interceptors, and so they're going into this battle with Hezbollah not ready for this. And this is an interesting story because on October 7th, Yoav Gallant, he wanted to invade simultaneously Gaza and Lebanon. And Netanyahu was threatened by the U.S. And there's this story that came in Foreign Affairs by Amos Harrell where on the day of October 7th, the meeting that needed to happen between Gallant and Netanyahu to make a war in the north was postponed, was literally blocked by locking the doors at the defense at Hakiria, the defense campus, to literally lock Gallant out to not be able to access the meeting that day, which allowed October 7th to pass. And then that window of opportunity for invading the north was sort of put on the back burner. Gallant and Netanyahu have hated each other long before this war. But there's people in the Israeli military who want to invade Lebanon. And there's people in the Israeli military that say invading Lebanon will destroy our country. So there's not even unanimity within their own society for something that is barreling towards an existential issue for them.
And now Netanyahu and Gallant are just openly falling out in public, politically within Israel.
Yeah, and last week, of course, I mean, was it a week ago? It's just like time is so warped these days. But Netanyahu was publicly leaking that he was going to fire Gallant,
Right.
because Gallant was on record, as we've reported, saying, you know, I don't think we're able to attack Lebanon, basically. And now
he started changing his tune. Yeah.
Changed his tune. So I mean, just as Netanyahu wants to keep the war and the genocide in Gaza going in order to save his own skin, there's an element of that. It's not the whole story, but it's certainly part of it. You know, at the moment the war stops, the government and the coalition is far more vulnerable than it's been at any time since October 7th. And there's an element of this massacre in Lebanon being about saving Yoav Gallant's job. Again, that's not the whole story, but I do think it's part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like what you were saying earlier in the stream, Ali, that there's, you know, there's a distinct possibility that even though it's not in their interest, they could end up invading anyway, which, you know, we kind of similar in some ways dynamic to what we saw with the ground invasion of Gaza. You know, they were being told by the Americans not to do it, and yet they still sort of talked themselves into doing it. And
the Americans didn't stop them. Incredibly important, because remember that, that the Americans have been very loud. The United States have been very loud the past couple of days saying, oh, we're against a ground invasion. We don't think that's the way to bring the captives, that we don't think that's the way to bring the Israeli settlers back to the north. Of course, the real reason is that the Pentagon, the United States, the hard-headed military people know Israel is unlikely to prevail in such a war against Hezbollah, just as Israel was completely defeated in 2006 when they invaded. But the U.S. is saying, oh, we're against it and we're trying to stop it. But they said that about Rafah, and it happened. Yeah. And John is still showing us videos of the resistance fighting the Israeli invaders in Rafah. So, you know, there's the fact that the U.S. says they're against it, if anything, is a reason to believe it will happen.
And they've achieved none of their primary goals in the Gaza Strip. You know, they have killed
none of their stated goals. None of
their stated goals. They've killed far more of their prisoners of war and detainees than they have rescued. And it's, you know, it with Lebanon, the whole calculation changes once there's a ground invasion. If there's a ground invasion, you know, we hope there won't be. But, you know, Hassan Nasrallah said in his speech last week that we wish that they invade. And I don't think that's bluster. You know, I think they will have the advantage. They will have the home advantage. And the Israelis' advantage that you mentioned earlier, of it, you know, in the air war, the technological superiority just vanishes overnight.
Well, there's a lot to keep our eyes on. There's too much. It's very overwhelming. You know, what can we expect from Iran and the rest of the axis of resistance. I mean, we saw, just in the last hour, I guess, a strike on Eilat, I think you said, from the Iraqi resistance.
That's the initial reporting.
The initial reports,
I
yeah.
haven't been able to follow up.
Yeah. But where is Iran in all of this? I believe Khomeini is speaking today, or maybe tomorrow. Where does this go?
I mean, that's a good question because, the new president, and we talked about the new president, Pezeshkian, a couple of weeks ago when we had Mohammed Marandi on, spoke at the UN, and it was spoke at the United Nations, the General Assembly, and also gave an interview with Al Jazeera. I only watched excerpts of that, but it was a very conciliatory speech saying, look, we don't want war with anyone. And some are interpreting that to say Iran's not going to do anything. I'm not sure that's right, because Iran's position has always been we don't want war with anyone. We're not looking for a war. But at the same time, it's been now, it was it July 31st that Ismail Haniyeh was murdered by Israel in Tehran. And it's now we're on the threshold of October, and the promised retaliation hasn't come. The Iranians said it will come. It might take longer than people expect, but at the same time, there's a lot of uncertainty about what Iran might do. But you do see in Hezbollah's behavior this sort of restraint, this very measured escalation. And so the fact that Iran is not jumping in is not necessarily out of tune with that. And Israel looks just absolutely that, their calculation may be Israel is destroying itself. Yes, people are taking terrible losses in Lebanon, not as bad as it would be in it would be far, far worse in a full-scale war, as we've seen in Gaza, where tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, are dead. So their calculation may be let Israel destroy itself. I don't know, but I think there's a lot of uncertainty about that. But they have capabilities that are in store. That much we know.
Yeah. And I think I said Khomeini, who, of course, died a long time ago. I meant Khamenei. But also, yeah, it's the rest of the axis of resistance. I mean, I think it's important to also, and John, maybe you can talk about this, where Yemen stands in this. What has Yemen been up to the last week since the attacks on Lebanon by Israel, and what kind of leverage do they have in terms of the Red Sea and the economic blockade, as this war of attrition kind of grinds on?
They've launched a few missiles. They launched a couple of cruise missiles and drones. And there was some talk about a ballistic missile being launched and intercepted that didn't have the strongest. Again, we got military censor in Israel, makes it difficult. But the capacity to land that Palestine 2 ballistic missile into the kitchen of Tel Aviv is an indication that is possible. If there's a number of those missiles in their capability, in their stocks, those could be used to great effect. And that's what happens when you make it a regional war. You can make it fire. You can have fire coming from all sides on Israel. And the way that we remember the Ansar Allah hit Tel Aviv with their drone was they flew it out over the sea and came in from the west. So you're getting hits from the north, south, east, and west. And that keeps your air defenses tied up because it keeps the batteries spread out, right? That keeps their Iron Dome and David Sling's batteries, the system that launches the interceptors. You have to spread them out. You have to put them in strategic places. You can't have them all in one place, and you can't have places with no coverage. So if you were to press the issue by firing consistently from those other fronts, you have the possibility to harass, I think is the word, but harass Israeli forces. I'm not sure.
And tie them down.
Tie them down and then have the attacks by Hezbollah be more effective. I'm not sure personally. Like I don't know if we need to speculate, but I don't know if Iran missed their window here, because I think that Iran very strongly wants to avoid a regional war. And I
agree.
think that the fight with Hezbollah has turned into an expanded war that now Gaza is fighting and now Hezbollah is fighting. And Iran doesn't want a regional war. And Hezbollah doesn't want a war either. They're very disciplined. Their position isn't, we want our country to be destroyed by American bombs that are given to Israel as gifts to drop on our people. So they have been very careful about this. And I think that that's where the ground war comes in. If Nasrallah is saying, come in on the ground, fight us on the ground, because a standoff battle, which could happen between Hezbollah and Israel with rockets and airstrikes, can go on for many, many months. A ground invasion is how, and we'll remember from 2006, there was an air war, rocket war component, and then Israel invaded. And when Israel invaded, they got hammered and they got trapped, and they wanted and they begged for a ceasefire. In Canada, our prime minister was one of the ones saying no ceasefire, no ceasefire. Israel was trying to get no ceasefire all through the
Tony Blair.
Tony Blair. And then they went into Bintish Bail. They got hammered, and all of a sudden they're looking back going, you guys want to hand us one of those ceasefires now and we'll sign it immediately. And they signed it immediately. And then they sent, after signing it, they sent hundreds of thousands of cluster bombs and rained them all over South Lebanon as a petty but murderous way of responding to the fact that they knew they couldn't beat them in a ground force. Their ground invasion in that war was mostly a rescue operation. The first invading force got pinned down, soldiers were killed, and then the rescue operations to save them came under attack, and they needed more forces to protect the rescue operation, and it just spiraled from there.
And I do think, thinking about the question regarding Iran and the axis of resistance, that Iran is playing a very long game. And I think it can be very frustrating for people, because when we see so much criminality, so much murder, so much genocide, so much deliberate targeting of civilians in the most purely evil way that Israel is doing, with the full support of the Joe Biden, Kamala Harris administration and the Keir Starmer government in the UK and the Olaf Scholz government in Germany and so on. People want to see a response to that. And I don't mean they want to see a response against Israeli civilians. They want to see a response that they would consider legitimate, such as, big missiles raining down on the Israeli defense headquarters, for example, or whatever it may be. But I think that they may be making a calculation that we can win a war of attrition. They're looking at this over decades, whereas Netanyahu's time frame is weeks and months. Can I get through this week? Can I get through the US election? Can I get through to January when the next president is inaugurated? And they don't look at it that way. They're looking at this in terms of a long game, and they need to preserve as much of their resources intact for the day when it becomes inevitable to use it. That may that may well be the strategy that they're taking, and I think that you see that in sort of the very clear but measured escalation that Hezbollah is doing, saying we're going to hit hard, we're willing to take losses, but we're not going to rush into a situation where it ends up with, Lebanon destroyed, if we can win another way. And the other way is through attrition, with Israel, in free fall. That may be the better strategy, but it takes longer, and it's tough. But when you don't have, and recall that speech that Nasrallah made a few weeks ago, when he emphasized, in a way I hadn't heard him emphasize before, that we don't have the same weapons as Israel. You may look at us and see
Right.
all these incredible feats, but that doesn't mean we're on a par with Israel in terms of quantity and even quality of weapons. But as John said, when I raised this 1 or 2 shows ago, they are equal or superior in terms of determination and ability to win a war with Israel. But
And manpower.
but the way they have to win that war is different, and it may be on a different time scale.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting Israel's goals in this war that they articulated the other day: to evacuate the south, to use as chips to return for the return of their people, move the Radwan forces, the special forces, off the border, degrade Hezbollah, and split Gaza and Lebanon into 2 separate fronts. They're not moving Radwan forces off the border. Degrading Hezbollah is a bit of a vague term that maybe they could do, but they're not going to split off Gaza and Hezbollah either. So they're setting themselves up for a road where there's no off-ramp that I see coming. So, and Hezbollah's goals, I think, are much more simple. They're to stick with Gaza, to defend Lebanon, which yesterday they announced, and to escalate without total war. They don't want total war. And anyone who's lived through a war doesn't want total war. They're brutal.